How did you gain access to the markets?
Me?
Yeah, you.
A lot of our friends were like, no, you're part of the problem. Like, we bailed out the banks. Everybody else felt like they got screwed. And so there were protests in New York. They were literally occupying Wall Street. But maybe this is something we can change with technology. If we could make access to market zero commission, wouldn't that actually be kind of directly speaking to the frustrations that people have about not being a part of the financial system?
Robinhood. How did that come about?
How indeed. Company was the brainchild of two good friends from college. We talked about it a little bit. I don't know if we were chatting. I can't remember if it was on the air. Right? I guess it was. Yeah, we were talking about Occupy Wall Street a little bit, right?
No, that was not on there.
Oh, that was just
Yeah.
that was before. Okay, yeah. So, do you remember Occupy?
I do.
What
I
was
don't remember like the whole premise of it. I don't know much about stocks or any of that kind of stuff. So you have to walk me through it a little bit. But I remember the movement. It was basically, from what I understand, it was the everyday Americans were getting pissed off that they couldn't invest in the stock market, correct?
that was a version of it that we saw. There were just general. I feel like the frustration was after 2008, right? Like, we bailed out the banks, and everybody else felt like they got screwed,
Yeah.
right? And I remember the exact number on this, but like a lot of the recovery did go back to the wealthiest in this country. And so we're talking like 2011. So this is 3 years ish after, 2 years after the financial crisis. And people were really, really upset about that. So there were protests in New York, right? They were literally occupying Wall Street. And we weren't a part of the protests, but we were working in finance in New York at the time, right? And we had a lot of friends in college, and they were like, "What are you doing, man?" And I was like, "What do you mean? What am I doing? I'm trying to." At the time, we were building a different finance company that was building technology for other financial institutions, like high, sort of computerized trading, low latency trading, you know, sort of like the direction that markets were becoming more and more electronic. And we're like, we're building technology to make markets more efficient. And a lot of our friends were like, no, you're part of the problem. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? Right? They're like, you guys are like not, you're part of the system, man. Like that sort of sentiment. So that was kind of the backdrop. And then we would see these protests happening in New York. And I remember just being like, the sentiment here is very real, right? But it's kind of like the idea of, and this was kind of, we talked a little bit about the immigrant background, right? But as people whose families made huge sacrifices to be in America, to look at the financial system and be like, this thing is messed up or rigged or doesn't work or whatever, right? It doesn't ring true. It's like that. This is the envy of everybody in the world, this financial system, right? Like we should have more people be a part of it. So this was kind of like the backdrop for what would become Robinhood. This was kind of the cultural backdrop, right? And I remember the genesis of the company started over a phone conversation that my co-founder and I had. And it was kind of like the company that we were building then like was not doing super well. And we're like, what else can we do? And we're like, like people are really upset about access to the markets. They're really upset about wealth inequality and all these things. And I remember the thought was, it's like, actually, access to the stock market is kind of a microcosm of this bigger thing that people are frustrated about. And we weren't going to be able to change politics. We weren't going to be able to change policy. And I think at the time, the sense was people want the government to do something about this. And this is probably the beginning of my like view towards individuality really emerging and kind of having the sense of like, the government's not going to solve this problem in no way. Like, that's not going to happen, right? Yep. Like, you're going to get some people that like make noise about it that get elected, and nothing's actually going to change here. But maybe this is something we can change with technology. This is kind of like the bright-eyed and bushy-tailed optimism you get from young people, right? When you don't know what you don't know, and we're like, we could change it. We could fix this problem. And if we could make access to market zero commission, which is kind of what the original idea behind the company was, wouldn't that actually be kind of directly speaking to the frustrations that people have about not being a part of the financial system? And this is where the bigger leap of faith came, right? It's like, and if more people of our generation were a part of the financial system, then they wouldn't be so frustrated, and we'd basically live in a more harmonious or like happier society. Because I didn't want to grow up with people being up in arms about this. Like it just seemed like a really nasty discourse. Enter Robinhood. Mobile, zero commission, and kind of like built from the ground up, brand new. At least the interface and the way the product looked was, I think, pretty different than what was out there at the time.
I mean, yeah, it was different. Everybody was
Totally
using it.
different. Yeah. When did you hear about it?
I don't remember. I don't remember exactly when I heard about it, but I remember. I remember when I did hear about it. It didn't matter how much money you had. You got access to the market, and I was like, oh, this is cool. So I started using it. I mean, I can't remember. It was probably around, I would bet 2010 time frame, maybe.
A little later than that. We released it publicly, I want to say in 2015.
Well, then it was
Around that time, yeah.
then it was after then.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did. I had heard about it, and I was like, oh, this is fucking cool.
You know what I was spending a lot of my time doing? Interviewing customers, talking to customers. Because I basically realized at a pretty early point in that company's history that if we try to build this product like Google builds Gmail, for example, right? That it wasn't going to go super well. And that the way that people used our product was going to be fundamentally a little different. What am I talking about here? If you have a person, like a very wealthy person, and you've got an ordinary person using an email client, right? The way that you use an email client is not going to be fundamentally different, right? You're like the rich person still like typing in a message and sending it to somebody. And so, for example, if you have a bunch of really well-paid engineers that are building Gmail, for example, and they're like, this is how I use it, and that's how I think other people are going to use it, the fact that those people make a lot of money is not going to it's not going to change their perspective on the product. Now, on the other hand, with a product like Robinhood, I think that's actually completely different. Because if you have a bunch of people in Silicon Valley that are making Silicon Valley tech startup salaries and income, and they're like, this is the way that I live my life. I live in an apartment, for example. I, have a really high rent. I'm not married. And I have a high, I have like a good income for my primary job. And you're like, I want to save enough money to be able to buy a $5 or $10 cup of coffee every day, right? This is not going to map to the expectations, reality, financial circumstances of people living in the rest of the country that are having kids when they're in their 20s and 30s, right? That are looking to buy a home pretty early on in life. Like that doesn't happen in the coastal cities in this country. Like the way people behave is pretty different. And I kind of had this idea that if we wanted to build a product that resonated with a large part of the population, that the way to do it was actually to make sure that we were getting the feedback from those kinds of people and incorporating that into the product. So even from the very early days of Robinhood, we would do this thing where we would go from, here's a feature that we want to build. It could be something small. It could be something like, could be how we introduce a new product, whatever. So you got a team of people working on it. You come up with a design for it. You come up with like how you think people are going to use it. And you create a prototype of it. You create a first version of it. What we would do even in the very, very early days of the company is we would make a prototype, and I would say, okay, if we start on Monday, then either on Friday evening or on Saturday morning, let's take the prototype that we built and let's go put it in front of some customers or some hypothetical customers. And at the time, we were at kind of either had just launched or had just announced the product. And so what we would do is we would go to Stanford campus and we just camp out at the coffee shop and just be like, hey, to random students, like, can we give you $50 for like 30 minutes of your time? And you just be like, here's a product or a feature. What does this do? Like, tell me what this does in your own words. And when you actually get to that point, it was pretty eye-opening because you're like, people don't see this the way that we do, right? People are in their own world. They're not paying attention. Like the amount of attention that people give to a new product or a new thing, pretty vanishing. And so if it's, for one example, right, was like zero commission stock trading. People are like, what the hell is that? They're like, is that like the interest rate on your car? And you're like, no. And then you let people ask their questions and you listen to it, and you're like, oh, it's like that thing when you trade a stock and you have to pay $10, because at the time a lot of brokerages were charging $10 commissions. And this is like closer to 15 years ago at this point, or not quite that much, about 10 years ago. And you're like, holy shit, people don't know what the basic part of this is. And so we have to unpack that and see if we can explain that to people in a way that makes sense. So you kind of like realize that if you're not getting actual feedback from people that use the product, who may have a pretty different financial life than you, you're going to be way off the mark. And what we ended up doing, and this was really important to me, is I would try to prioritize time every quarter, every half, to go and travel somewhere outside of the Bay Area and just interview people. And a lot of the times in those interviews, we'd have like an actual like customer research person that we'd hired leading the interviews. And I'd just be sitting in the room listening, kind of forming opinions, and people are like, who are you? I'm like, oh, I just work here. Don't mind me. It's kind of interesting, right? Because that took us to a lot of middle America.
So the whole premise was to get everyday Americans access to the stock market and crypto, correct?
Yeah.
How did you gain access to the markets?
Me?
Yeah, you. How did the app, how did Robinhood get access to the markets? Without going through all the middlemen?
Oh, I thought you were asking how I got introduced to the stock market.
No, how did Robinhood get introduced?
Yeah, so we are still a broker dealer. So we're registered as a broker dealer. And when we started the company, we worked with a lot of financial institutions on the back end. So we worked with a third-party clearing firm, right? We worked with a lot of different service providers. And so we kind of got the regulatory licenses and stuff to be able to offer this service. But we were a little startup, right? We were like 15, 20 people when we first launched the product. Like that's
Wow.
teeny tiny, right? And so we kind of had this path where we went from building the parts that we had the resources to build to, over the next 5 to 10 years, sort of vertically integrating key parts of the company over time. So a couple of years after we started the company, we went self-clearing. So we built our own clearinghouse, and that was a big sort of like, technology build out basically.
How fast did Robinhood take off? No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.